India's macroeconomic data currently shows consistent top-line momentum. Massive infrastructure projects are being assembled across the subcontinent at an accelerated pace. This modernization extends into the daily economy through digital payment networks like UPI, which now processes billions of seamless transactions every month. These metrics are reflected in the official 2025 macroeconomic reports. According to these top-line figures, the national unemployment rate sits at 3.1%. The labor force participation rate, measuring the working-age population either employed or actively seeking work, remains steady at 59.3%. However, household-level surveys and studies of the informal sector reveal a lack of permanent jobs for educated youth and persistent distress among low-wage workers. Reconciling these two views requires looking past the aggregate numbers to analyze a labor market mechanism economists call the ratchet effect. The primary tool for tracking these employment figures is the Periodic Labor Force Survey, or PLFS. The PLFS calculates employment using 365-day and 7-day windows. Crucially, the 3.1% unemployment rate only counts those actively seeking work. It completely omits discouraged workers. Factoring in these labor force exits, 25% of youth are not in employment, education, or training. The data shows a severe gender disparity. Male participation stands at 79.1%, while female participation is 40%, driven by childcare and caregiving constraints that frequently force women out of the formal labor market. The 3.1% headline rate serves as a statistical byproduct of labor force attrition, concealing a system where millions of working-age adults have simply stopped looking for work. This labor force exit accelerated in March 2020. The COVID-19 lockdown triggered an immediate sudden stop in urban economic activity. Standard economic models predict a V-shaped recovery following a shock, but India shows a ratchet effect, an asymmetric adjustment where employment shifts downward and fails to reverse. Economists measure this difference in differences estimator by comparing vulnerable workers against formal groups post-pandemic. Panel data from the height of the shock confirms the impact. Only 43% of informal workers retained their jobs between December 2019 and April 2020. The recovery of earnings has been incomplete. While those who returned to urban areas reached 90% of their prior income, workers who remained in rural areas saw their earnings drop to 23% of pre-pandemic levels. For millions of informal and migrant workers, the pandemic triggered a permanent downward shift in their economic status, leaving them stranded in lower-tier roles even after the recovery. 4 specific mechanisms prevented a bounce-back. First, firm exit. The permanent closure of micro and small businesses destroyed millions of existing job matches. Second, firms maintained the nominal wages of regular employees by exclusively firing variable and contract workers, reducing the pool of available informal jobs. Third, prolonged unemployment led to skill erosion and discouragement, causing many individuals to stop seeking work. Finally, mass reverse migration severed urban labor networks. Millions of workers were disconnected from their employers and the urban markets they relied on. Government data shows that 51% of these migrants left due to direct job loss, while 28% left due to fear of the virus, far outweighing those who left to work from home. Distance, skill mismatches, and the loss of urban housing created significant frictions that prevented workers from seamlessly returning to their prior roles once lockdowns lifted. These 4 mechanisms collectively broke the feedback loop for informal labor, solidifying the ratchet effect. Simultaneously, the broader economy has accelerated a long-term structural transition. The 2025 labor survey highlights this shift. Agricultural employment has dropped to 43% of the total workforce. This labor is moving into non-farm sectors, with worker participation rising to 12.1% in manufacturing and 13.1% in services. This movement represents a shift towards formalization. Regular wage and salaried employment has risen to 23.6%, moving workers away from subsistence self-employment. These sectoral changes have also cooled rural inflation, which has dropped below urban inflation for the first time in years. Because food carries a heavier weight in rural consumption baskets, easing food prices has disproportionately reduced economic stress for rural households. This steady flow of labor into manufacturing and the stabilization of rural prices represent a genuine modernization of the Indian economy. We are witnessing 2 simultaneous phenomena: a jagged ratchet effect for the informal sector and a structural transition. At the aggregate level, millions successfully move into stable salaried roles, but this transition leaves behind a vulnerable subset whose earning baseline was permanently lowered. While the economic debate often centers on a boom versus crash binary, the data shows a volatile, bifurcated transition, where aggregate gains and individual scarring occur simultaneously. The primary barrier to resolving this dual reality is the bottleneck, preventing scarred rural labor from joining the booming manufacturing and service sectors. India faces a significant skill deficit. Only 4.2% of the workforce aged 15 to 59 has received formal vocational or technical training. Standard GDP growth cannot naturally absorb these workers because of this skill mismatch. Policy must focus on extending portable social protections to migrants and scaling active labor market programs, such as apprenticeship-linked education, to bridge this gap. Overcoming the ratchet effect requires actively connecting displaced workers to India's high-tech future, rather than waiting for statistical momentum to repair structural wounds.